It was 2:30 a.m. when I first heard the call. As I sat there in the sterile, dimly lit security booth, watching the surveillance monitors flicker on the screen in front of me, I felt that familiar shiver. Something in the air had changed. The usual hum of the building's cooling system seemed distant, almost muffled, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I was working the graveyard shift at the old textile factory on the outskirts of town. No one worked in the factory anymore. It was abandoned, except for a skeleton crew of night shift security guards who watched over the massive space just in case. Most of the time, it was uneventful. I'd sit in my booth, occasionally checking the perimeter of the building, making sure the floodlights were working, the doors were locked. It was a lonely job, but the pay was good, and I had to pay the bills. This particular night, I had been on duty for about 5 hours. The place felt off, though. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly. The hallways stretched on endlessly, filled with the faint echoes of the past, shadows flickering in places where there shouldn't have been any. Maybe it was the fact that the building was old, or the fact that I'd been working the night shift for way too long. But something about tonight felt different. And then the call. It came through the old intercom system, crackling to life as I adjusted the volume. At first, I thought it was just static. But then a voice, faint but distinct, broke through. "Help me." My heart skipped. The voice sounded like it was coming from deep within the building, like it was trapped somewhere far away. A woman's voice. It was desperate, shaky, like she had been calling for help for a long time. I froze, unsure what to do. No one else should have been in the building. We'd had reports of trespassers before, but they were always just kids, sneaking in for a thrill. This was different. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Who's there?" No answer, just the same eerie crackling sound. I didn't know what to do. Protocol said I should investigate if there was any unusual activity. But that voice, that distress, felt real, and it sent a chill down my spine that made my blood run cold. I picked up my flashlight, grabbed the security logbook, and made my way toward the factory floor, the heavy steel doors creaking open with a low groan as I stepped into the vast, empty space. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of rusted machines, long-forgotten remnants of a factory that once hummed with life. Now it was quiet, save for the sound of my boots echoing on the concrete. But the further I walked, the more I felt it, like something was watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Another call crackled over the intercom. This time it was more distinct. "I'm still here. Please, help me." I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached the factory floor, my flashlight beam sweeping over the rows of forgotten machines. The factory seemed like an endless labyrinth of cold, steel structures. There were places that no one had seen in years, sections of the building that were off-limits, sealed off because of structural damage. But this voice, it was calling me from somewhere deep inside. I followed the sound of the intercom static, trying to pinpoint the location. It was louder now, like it was coming from somewhere beneath the factory floor. I glanced down at the metal grating, hoping to spot some sign of where this was coming from. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint outline on the floor. A door. But it wasn't a normal door. It was hidden, barely visible beneath the dust and grime. A trapdoor. I crouched down, brushing the dust aside. The hinges were rusted, but the door was still intact. I pulled at the handle, and it gave way with a loud screech. My flashlight flickered as I shone it down into the darkness below. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, winding into the unknown. The air from below smelled damp, stale, like something had been down there for far too long. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. But that voice, weak, desperate, kept repeating in my mind, "Help me." With a deep breath, I descended into the darkness. The steps creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder the further I went. My heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't ignore what I had heard. Someone needed help. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, cramped hallway. The walls were covered in grime and rust, and the flickering light from my flashlight revealed old, yellowed papers scattered across the floor. The entire area had the feel of something long forgotten, an abandoned part of the factory hidden away from prying eyes. I moved cautiously, my footsteps muffled in the thick dust. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked deeper into the hallway, the air growing thick with a sense of dread. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor was a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. The crack between the door and the frame revealed a sliver of light, and I could hear faint sounds from inside. I approached, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. But before I could touch it, I froze. From behind me, I heard something move, the faintest scrape of shoes on the floor, almost too quiet to hear. My stomach dropped. I turned around quickly, but the hallway behind me was empty. I stepped forward again, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was small, lined with old industrial equipment, some kind of storage room. But what caught my attention wasn't the machinery. It was the figure hunched in the corner, shrouded in shadows. It was a woman. Her hair was disheveled, tangled, and her clothes were torn, as if she had been trapped in this room for a long time. Her eyes met mine, wide and full of fear, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. I was not alone. I slammed my back against the door, the cold metal pressing into my skin. The woman's eyes were locked on mine, her expression a mix of desperation and something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She was sitting on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest as if she was trying to protect herself from something. For a brief moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint sounds of movement came again. Only this time, they were louder. The scraping noise from behind me, right on the edge of my hearing, sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I turned my head quickly, shining my flashlight down the narrow hallway, but there was nothing, just shadows, endless, deep shadows. But they were moving. I was sure of it. The woman's lips parted, her eyes wide and pleading. She wasn't trying to speak. She was trying to warn me. Get out. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hit me like a slap to the face. Don't look. Behind you. I didn't need to be told twice. My flashlight shook in my hand as I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in knots. There was something in the hallway now. I saw it, or rather, I felt it before I saw it. The darkness, which had once seemed so still, was now swirling in unnatural ways. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, as if alive, pulling themselves out from every crack and crevice. I heard low, guttural whispers, too faint to understand, but enough to make the blood in my veins run cold. And then it moved. A shape, too quick to be fully comprehended, darted past the end of the hallway, just out of the beam of my flashlight. My breath hitched in my throat as I instinctively stepped backward, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes flitted around the room, searching for any sign of where the thing had gone. The woman's voice broke through the panic rising in my chest. It's not safe. It's never safe. They won't stop. Her words were broken, like she couldn't fully process what she was seeing or what was coming. I could feel it now. It was here. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it closing in, the air growing heavier with every passing second. The shadows moved faster, more erratically now, and they were growing. I had to get out, now. But as I turned to flee, I heard a sickening sound, like the scraping of nails across the floor, coming from behind me. Too close. The door I had just passed through was now shut tight, and the woman, she wasn't there anymore. I spun around in a panic, my flashlight catching the barest glimpse of something in the corner of the room. Something long, dark, and crawling along the floor. I didn't wait to see more. My legs moved before my brain could even process what was happening, and I was running down the hall, my footsteps pounding, my heart racing. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting frantic beams of light into the thick, endless blackness. But no matter how fast I ran, it felt like the shadows were closing in on me, like they were chasing me. And then I heard it. The whispers were no longer distant. They were right behind me. "We're not done with you. Not yet." The voice was not human. It was guttural, distorted, as if it came from the depths of something ancient and evil. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. In front of me was another hallway, the door to the outside just at the end. I pushed myself forward, faster than I ever thought I could move. But as I reached the door, my hand gripping the handle, something stopped me. The shadows. They were crawling across the floor, blocking the door. I couldn't open it. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me, suffocating me. I could feel them against my skin, like cold fingers brushing over me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her face pale, her eyes hollow and dark, her lips parted again, and this time, I could hear her clearly. "Leave, before it takes you to." I don't know how I did it, but I pulled the door open just enough to squeeze through. The moment I stepped into the cold night air, I felt the pressure lift, like something invisible had been pushing down on me the entire time. I turned and looked back at the factory. The shadows were still there, lingering, shifting, but they weren't chasing me anymore. I didn't know if I was dreaming. I didn't know if I was losing my mind. But as I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. I had just witnessed something that I was never meant to see. I couldn't sleep for days after that night. The images kept replaying in my mind. The woman, the shadows, the whispers that had crawled under my skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel that suffocating air, the cold touch of something following me, hunting me. It was as if a part of me had stayed in that factory, trapped in the darkness with whatever it was that lived there. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, something I imagined after spending too many hours alone in that cold, forgotten building. But deep down, I knew it was real. I quit my job the very next day. Couldn't go back. I couldn't bring myself to walk into that place again. The factory was condemned anyway, they said, so it wasn't like they'd need me for anything more. But that didn't end it. The dreams started. At first, it was just shadows in the corner of my vision, flickers of movement when I wasn't looking directly. Then the whispers started. Low at first, like a distant hum, muffled but persistent. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, heart racing, convinced I was still there, back in that factory. The shadows would crawl along the walls of my room. The air would grow heavy again, and I could hear her voice, faint but unmistakable. "It's not safe. It's never safe." I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it. Stress, I told myself. PTSD. But that only lasted so long. One night, about a week after I quit, I received an unexpected call. It was from the manager of the factory. Her name was Karen, and she had been the one who hired me for the night shift in the first place. I hadn't spoken to her since I left, so her call caught me off guard. "John," she said, her voice oddly strained, "I need you to come back. There's something we found in the factory." I felt my heart drop to my stomach. The last thing I wanted to do was set foot in that place again. But Karen's voice had a weight to it. It wasn't the usual professional tone. It sounded fearful, almost desperate. I didn't respond at first. I could feel a cold chill creeping up my spine as I thought about everything that had happened. "John, please," she begged. "We can't handle this ourselves. I don't know what it is, but it's starting to spread. It's in the building now. I need you to help us." Something in her voice broke me. I knew I had to go back. I didn't want to, but I had to. The next morning, I found myself standing at the gates of the old factory once again. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. The building loomed before me, silent and still, but I could feel it. It was watching me, waiting for me to come inside. As I stepped through the gates, the air seemed to shift. I could feel my pulse quicken, and the whispers from my dreams returned, distant at first but growing louder as I approached the entrance. When I walked into the building, it was even worse than I remembered. The shadows were thicker here, darker, clinging to the walls and the machines. The silence was oppressive, like the place itself was holding its breath. Karen was waiting for me inside. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, maybe longer. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We found something in the basement," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the building itself is alive. The shadows, they move on their own now. They're everywhere." We walked down to the basement, my mind racing with every step. As we descended the stairs, I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavier. The walls were damp, the light from our flashlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. We reached the bottom and entered the same hallway I'd run down that night. The door at the end of the hall, the one I had tried to escape through, was open. Inside, there was nothing but an empty room, just as I remembered it. Except for one thing. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily, as though by someone desperate. The floor was littered with broken machinery parts, and in the center of the room was a large, dark stain that seemed to seep into the ground itself. It was fresh. "We don't know what it is, but it's been getting worse every night," Karen said. "The workers who tried to come in, they've been reporting strange things. Disappearances, shadows following them. One of them swears he saw a figure standing in the corner, but when he went to investigate, it wasn't there anymore." I stepped closer to the center of the room, feeling drawn to the stain. My skin tingled, like it was alive, pulsing under my fingertips. The whispers were louder now, echoing in my mind, each word scraping like nails on a chalkboard. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the room. Tall, shadowy, formless, just a silhouette. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it was watching me. I turned to Karen, but she was gone, and the door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed with such force that it shook the walls around me. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped around, expecting to see Karen standing there, her eyes wide with shock. But there was nothing. No one. Panic set in. My breath quickened as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the entire building was holding its breath, and I could hear that low, guttural whisper again. Closer now, as if something was right behind me, its cold, unseen presence pressing in. I turned back to the room and froze. The shadow was still there. It hadn't moved, but its form seemed to grow, expanding, stretching along the walls, creeping toward me. My flashlight flickered, its beam casting wild patterns across the room. But the shadow didn't fade. It seemed to absorb the light, swallowing it whole. I wanted to scream, but the fear paralyzed me. My feet were rooted to the floor, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like the room was shrinking around me, the walls closing in as the figure slowly stepped forward. And then I heard it, clear as day. "Leave." The voice wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, like the growl of some ancient, malevolent force. The air around me grew colder still, a biting chill that seemed to gnaw at my very bones. The figure began to take shape, the edges of its form becoming more defined, more solid. Its height towered over me, its presence overwhelming. But there was something else, something that made my stomach churn. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a writhing mass of shadows and darkness. It had no eyes, no mouth, just an empty void, a blackness so deep it seemed to suck in all light and hope. I backed away again, my hand reaching for the door, desperate to escape. But it was no use. The figure was closing in. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, like it was choking me. Couldn't breathe. "Leave," the voice boomed, and the force of it pushed me back, throwing me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling, my mind racing. I could feel the thing's presence, like it was inside me, rooting around in my thoughts, twisting them into something dark and terrifying. I wasn't just being hunted. I was being consumed. I had to get out. I had to survive. I stumbled backward toward the far side of the room, my eyes desperately searching for any way out. But the shadows were closing in, swallowing the space around me. The room seemed to stretch farther than it should, as if it was changing, warping. Time and space felt like they were bending under the weight of whatever this thing was. That's when I noticed something. In the center of the room, where the dark stain had been, there was a strange mark, an intricate symbol drawn into the floor. It was glowing faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. It was the source. I reached for it instinctively, my hands shaking as I touched the symbol. As soon as my fingers made contact, the world seemed to shudder. The shadows writhed and twisted violently, and the figure let out a horrific screech, as if it were being torn apart. The whispers became a roar, deafening and suffocating. But just as quickly as the chaos had started, everything went still. The shadows stopped moving. The whispers ceased. The air was thick with a quiet, unnatural calm. I pulled my hand away from the symbol, my heart racing. I didn't know what I had done, but I could feel it. Whatever had been in this room, whatever had been feeding on the fear and darkness, was momentarily quiet. I didn't wait to find out what came next. I rushed to the door again, and this time it opened without resistance, as if the building had finally decided to let me go. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, my mind reeling from the terror of what I had just witnessed. As I reached the stairwell and raced up to the ground level, I heard a voice. It wasn't the thing's voice. It wasn't Karen's. It was the woman from the factory. "Go now before it finds you." I didn't stop running. I burst through the exit doors, into the cold, early morning air, and I didn't look back. But I knew that whatever had been in that factory, whatever dark force had lived in the shadows, wasn't gone. It wasn't over. It was just waiting for the next person to step inside, for the next soul to feed on. And I could feel it. Even as I drove away, as the factory receded in my rearview mirror, I knew it was still there, following me, watching, waiting. I thought I had escaped. I thought that leaving the factory behind, driving miles away, would give me the peace I so desperately needed. But the truth is, you can never escape something like that. Once it has marked you, it never lets you go. For weeks, I tried to live as if nothing had happened. I returned to a semblance of normalcy, went to work, saw friends, tried to sleep without hearing those whispers. But they never stopped. They followed me in my dreams, in my waking moments, their presence crawling under my skin like a slow poison. And then the first sign came. It was a Thursday night. I had just gotten home from work, tired, frustrated, desperate to find some semblance of peace. I threw my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and flopped onto the couch. The house was quiet, too quiet. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound from the corner of the living room, like something was dragging its nails across the wooden floor. I sat up, my heart racing. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind outside. I knew that sound. Slowly, I got to my feet, my legs trembling. My eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, creeping along the walls, twisting like living things. But I couldn't see anything directly. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crawled over me like ice. And then, a voice. A whisper, faint at first, but it grew louder. "Come back." It was the same voice I had heard in the factory. The thing, the shadow, the entity that had haunted that place. I felt the bile rise in my throat. It wasn't real, couldn't be real. But deep down, I knew it was. This thing was relentless. It was trying to draw me back in, to finish what it had started. I turned toward the window, the faint moonlight shining through the curtains. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the house, framed by the darkness. Tall, formless, its body composed of writhing shadows. The shape of it sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my chest. It was real. My mind raced for an explanation, for anything to make sense of this nightmare, but there was no reasoning with something like this. The shadows were alive. The darkness wasn't just a void. It was a predator. and it had been hunting me ever since that night in the factory. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to us." The figure outside the window moved closer, its shape shifting, elongating as it approached the glass. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at it, paralyzed with fear. And then I remembered the symbol, the mark I had touched in the factory, the one that had caused the shadows to retreat, if only for a brief moment. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be a way to break the cycle before it consumed me completely. I bolted for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. They were getting closer. The shadows were coming for me. I ran out into the street, my breath ragged, my legs weak beneath me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay there, not with it so close. The streets were eerily quiet, and the moonlight cast long shadows along the sidewalks. As I looked around, I saw them. More figures, more shadows, lurking in the corners of my vision. They weren't just in the house anymore. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. I could feel them closing in, and I knew that I had to make a choice. I had to find the symbol again, the one I had touched in the factory, and destroy it. The entity, the thing that had been hunting me, could be stopped. But only if I severed the connection. Only if I erased it. I don't know how long I ran, but I eventually found myself at the edge of town, standing in front of the old factory again. The building loomed before me, just as dark and oppressive as before. But this time, something was different. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. The shadows weren't just outside now. They were inside the walls. I didn't hesitate. I knew what had to be done. I forced open the gates, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran toward the entrance, past the rusted machinery, past the place where everything had started. The darkness seemed to move around me, twisting and shifting as I approached the basement once again. The door was ajar, and I stepped inside, my pulse racing. There it was, the mark on the floor, glowing faintly. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I pressed my hand against the symbol. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, only determination. The moment my skin made contact with the mark, the entire building shook. The whispers roared in my ears, deafening, suffocating. The shadows writhed and screamed as if in pain, and the air grew impossibly cold. But I held on. I pressed harder. And then, with a final, bone-shaking crack, the darkness shattered. Everything went silent. The building around me seemed to breathe, exhaling a deep, mournful sigh as the shadows evaporated, as if they were being pulled away, sucked into some far-off void. The oppressive air lightened, and I could breathe again. The mark on the floor faded. The whispers were gone, and I was free. I don't know what happened to the factory after that. I don't know if the entity still haunts it, waiting for the next person to come along. But I know that whatever it was, it won't be coming for me again. I left that town the next morning, never looking back. I never spoke to Karen again, and I never went near that place. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel the shadows shifting in the corners of my vision, and I wonder just how far it reaches.